All right, good afternoon, students. Welcome to the cinematography classroom. As you know, in our last lesson, we were discussing the concept of genre in film. In this lesson, we will continue exploring other genres that we have not been able to discuss yet. So please get ready to take notes on this new lesson that we're going to title More Genres. As we stated previously, when we talk about genre refers to the method that we use to categorize films that is based on the similarity of narrative elements within each film. And most film genres are borrowed from literary genre criticism. Because as you know, there is a sharing between the world of literature and the world of cinematography. So what we're going to do now is that we're going to continue where we left off in our last intervention. The next genre that I want to discuss with you is known as Gothic in literature, but in cinematography, we call it horror. And when we talk about horror, horror is the type of genre in film that pretends to deliberately repulse or frighten the audience through suspense, violence, or shock. And atmosphere is very important because atmosphere is what creates the mood that leads to people or the audience watching the film being frightened. So, in order to have a successful horror film, atmosphere is something that needs to be built with a lot of caution and very deliberately. There are several subgenres of horror. As you know, there are many genres and there are many subgenres that branch out of these genres. And horror is going to be another of those genres that deal with the extraordinary. Making reference to our last lesson, we discussed a genre called fantasy. And one of the things that we said about fantasy is that fantasy deals with extraordinary events. And extraordinary is anything that is not ordinary. The things that seem out of place, things that are inexplicable, things that would probably be called impossible. And in fantasy, the justification will always be that whatever extraordinary event happens, happens because it is magical. That is the way it is explained. In horror, there are two types of horrors. We have to distinguish between psychological horror and one that deals more with events that could be considered extraordinary, like supernatural. And supernatural horror is a type of horror where events that happen are like impossible. They're completely extraordinary. And these are, again, justified or explained away as being supernatural in nature. When we use the word supernatural, refers to events or circumstances that go or transcend beyond the laws of the natural world, beyond science and rationality. So, the first subgenre that we're going to see in horror films will be monster films. These are stories about creatures that terrorize people. They had this subgenre has been around for many years. You have famous horror movies from the 30s, such as Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Werewolf, the Dracula. And nowadays we have other monsters, some of them inspired in Japanese kaiju, like Godzilla and the creature from Cloverfield. Another type of horror film that became particularly um, popular in the 1980s was the slasher film. This type of film has no appeal to me, but it seemed to have a lot of appeal for people back in the 80s, where usually you have this typical uh, crazy person, this slasher that goes around killing his victims by creeping up to them with sharp objects like a chef's knife or a machete, you name it. So you're probably familiar with famous horror characters such as Leatherface that kills people with his chainsaw. You have Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th films where he kills people with a giant machete, and many, many, many others. Survival horror is probably the most popular nowadays. These are the type of films that put the protagonist in a risky life or death situation that they need to endure. And they often have to endure things such as a zombie apocalypse. So you know what I'm talking about, right? And they have many obstacles that they have to overcome in order to survive. Supernatural horror, that is the type of horror that we were making allusion to at the beginning, are stories about the intrusions of spirits of the dead, or demons, or demonic possessions, or dark witchcraft, or evil sorcerers, or even figures like the Antichrist into the living, into the realm of the living. The nature of these stories presuppose the existence of a side of good and a side of evil, right? You have the forces of good versus the forces of evil. They are sometimes represented as the side that sides with God and the side that sides with the devil, right? Good versus bad, good versus evil. And you can see examples of this type of subgenre in films like Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and more recently in films like the Paranormal series Activities and James Wan, The Conjuring series also. Leaving horror behind us, we have a type of genre now that is distinctively cinematic. This is one that you don't see in literature, but it has its own narrative style. And these are musicals. Musicals are film genres in which songs are sung by the characters, and they are sometimes interwoven into the narrative of the film. Sometimes it's followed by a performance of dances and things like that. In some cases, you have the songs advancing the plot. These movies are a little bit more operatic. Movies like, for example, Les Miserables, where the entire movie they are singing. A most recent example will be a film called Cats, and you have other films like the 1970s Jesus Christ Superstar, where they are singing. The dialogue is it's part of the narrative. But the most popular type of musical is that where you have a film that looks like a regular film, and then the movie is interrupted. There's a break in the storyline to show an elaborate production number where people start singing and dancing, like in Greece, would be the perfect example of that type of musical. And they were very popular in 1930s, 40s, and 50s. The first movie with dialogue, the first talkie, was a film called The Jazz Singer that came out in 1928. And that first talkie happened to be a musical. And there, unfortunately, you have a guy with blackface, right? Because I suppose they couldn't find a black performer, right? Because there are no black people in the United States. So you have a guy dressed up here in blackface performing. There were also musicals in which we had Hispanics be very prominent. One of the most famous musicals ever made is a movie called The West Side Story, of which they made a remake that should be coming out any moment now. I don't know why they made a remake of such a famous movie, because you want to see the original West Side Story. There it is. And here you have a picture of famous actress Rita Moreno, Puerto Rican, one of the finest actresses that we have ever seen in Hollywood. And this woman, right? She's a full package. She's one of those rare performers that has won awards in different forms of entertainment. She won the Oscar for her role in West Side Story. She's also the winner of Grammys, that are awards given for TV performances, and also the Tony, that is given for Broadway performances. Leaving behind the musical, we have science fiction or sci-fi. And sci-fi is the third type of genre that deals with the extraordinary. We already said that fantasy justifies everything with the word magic. Oh, this is happening and it's extraordinary. It's because it's magical. The horror does it because, oh, it's supernatural. We don't understand it. It transcends comprehension. It transcends the laws of science and the laws of nature. It is beyond nature. And in science fiction, things are explained in a scientific way. Why is that carpet flying? Well, in fantasy, they will tell you because it's magic. If it were horror, they were saying, oh, because some evil spirit is making it raise up in the air. In science fiction, they would probably tell you, oh, it's that it has an interwoven anti gravitational material that makes it negate gravity. I know it sounds like pure baloney what I'm saying now, but it also sounds kind of like pseudoscientific, right? Because I just threw the word gravity in there. So that's what science fiction usually does. It just throws around scientific words to make it sound scientific, to make it sound reasonable. Of course, if you are a scientist, most of the time you know better. There are science fiction movies that make very good use of science, and there are those that just throw around scientific words to make it sound scientific, even if it's not. So this is the third genre that also presents extraordinary events. They present things like the effects of new technologies, things like travel through space, travel through time, alternative universes, alien life forms, genetical engineering, and other such issues. And science fiction was not very respected at the beginning. I mean, it's been around since George Méliès did The Trip to the Moon in 1902. And if you look at the early science fiction movies, many of them are ridiculous. They are B films and they were like not taken very seriously until 1968. In 1968, a movie came out that started establishing science fiction as more mainstream and a legitimate genre on its own. That was the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. And in the 1970s, it started gaining more notoriety and more respect. And we had an explosion in the late 70s and early 80s of science fiction films. And they are a very well respected genre today and one that people enjoy very much. The masses enjoy very much. Let's look at the different categories of science fiction. They include apocalyptic or post apocalyptic fiction. And these are concerned with the end of civilization, either through a nuclear war, a plague of some kind, or some kind of general disaster. And there are many films out there that deal with this typical scenario. It is said you have either movies that are apocalyptic and they end with this apocalypse, the disaster, or movies that begin after such an event, after such a disaster. And they usually focus on the travails of the survivors. We have films like 2001, in this case, the one I mentioned earlier, that belong to a subgenre called hard science fiction. A more recent example will be Christopher Nolan's Interstellar. Hard science fiction is the type of science fiction that presents science that is very detailed, science that is very well researched, and that is considered plausible. In other words, what they show here could likely happen in the future. It's very likely to happen. You have authors, for example, like Arthur C. Clarke, because sometimes science fiction can, to an extent, predict the future very well. Arthur C. Clarke, for example, was one of the titans of science fiction in the 20th century. And one of the early things that he introduced in his novels was the concept of the communication satellite. Do communication satellites exist today? Of course. And we use them every day. Every time we're streaming something to our TV, every time that we're using the internet and we're going to a website that is in another country. Uh, Even now, the use of the internet and the capacity they have to transmit this lesson to any part of the world can happen because of the communication satellite. What used to be science fiction today is science fact. And hard science fiction is uh, works that way. It presents scenarios that are plausible. It could happen. Some, of course, will never happen because the science is horrific. It's bad. You also have something called future noir. The word noir is a French word that means black or dark. And these are usually films that combine Film noir, that is a style of film that we shared with you early in this course with science fiction. And that can be seen in films such as Blade Runner and The Terminator. Military science fiction, of course, is those that present wars in the future. And of course, if it's in the future, you're going to see them using technologies that do not exist today. And you also have the space opera. Space opera is a type of science fiction that is categorized by the extent of space travel and is distinguished by the amount of time that the protagonists spend in an active spacefaring lifestyle. So they spend most of the time in space and having adventures in space, very epic adventures. That's why we call it a space opera. Examples of this type of science fiction include Firefly, Star Trek, the Star Trek films, Star Blazers, and Star Wars, even though we said it is science fantasy. If we decided to categorize it as science fiction, we could categorize it as space opera because of its epic qualities and because of the amount of time that these stories spend and dedicate to space travel. And we have something else called cyberpunk. And cyberpunk is a futuristic storyline that deals with people who have been either physically or mentally enhanced with cutting edge cybernetic components. That's why you see that cyborgs, a cyborg is a combination of man and machine, are a major theme in this type of story. And usually the themes are somewhat cynical and dystopian. When we talk about dystopia, we're talking about a type of political genre that presents societies that are very dark and sinister. And usually, a protagonist in this type of movie will be a hacker or some type of person that lives on the fringes of society that is trying to overcome this uh, type of oppressive environment. I think that the best example I can give you of a cyberpunk movie, the most successful, will be The Matrix. Moving on to another genre, we have the thriller. The thriller is sometimes confused with horror. And sometimes a thriller can be borderline horror, but we should never confuse them because they are their own thing. While horror is aiming to repulse and scare you, the thriller uses fear. I'm not going to say it does not. It uses fear and excitement, but it's more geared to excite you, to thrill you, or to create suspense. Sometimes the line can be sometimes, not always, and be a little bit fuzzy, but I think that they are different enough for us to be able to make a distinction. The thriller is also known as the suspense genre, and it is often mixed with action, adventure, and the mystery genre. Uh, but the level of terror makes it sometimes borderline horror at times as well. It generally has a serious theme, which makes it very dramatic, and there are several subgenres of the thriller. One being the psychological thriller. This one emphasizes the psychological condition of the protagonist, and this psychological condition presents obstacles to his objectives or to his goals. Some psychological thrillers are about complicated stories that try to deliberately confuse you. A film that comes to my mind is the Machinist, about this man that had not been able to sleep for a year, and it's a very creepy film. It's a psychological thriller. This man has visions that he does not understand. At the end of the film, obviously, everything is revealed as to why he had not been able to sleep for a year and why he is seeing the things that he sees. But the movie is a thriller, it's not a horror film. Other very popular thrillers include the disaster thriller. These are thrillers about mass peril that involves many people, and where the hero's job is to survive and save as many other people as possible from a grim fate. So you have these natural disasters. Sometimes you have movies about earthquakes, and the earthquake destroys like this big city, and the hero's trying to survive and save his family. Like in the case of this movie called Saint Andreas. Other thrillers include the crime thriller, which is a thriller that revolves around the life of either detective, criminals, or groups associated in criminal events. This one overlaps with crime stories. You can find this subgenre in either crime or the thriller. So there's an overlap here. You have the techno thriller that was made very popular by the novels of Tom Clancy, and many of the novels of Tom Clancy have been turned into films, such as The Hunt for the Red October and the Jack Ryan films, like movies such as Patriot Games and A Clear and Present Danger. The techno thriller revolves usually around technology and the danger behind the technology that sometimes organizations or even the government uses against people, and including it also includes the threat of cyber terrorism. You know, technology can be used in many dark and sinister ways. And then there's another type of film called erotic thriller, but I'm not going to go there. But I'm just mentioning it so you can know there's another type of thriller. Okay, we have discussed genres already. Question: are documentaries a film genre? There's a type of film that is called a documentary. Could that be a genre? What do you say? I think that you already know that the answer is it's not a genre. Even though it's a non-genre way of categorizing films, it's a legitimate way of categorizing movies, the documentary. But it is not genre-based by any stretch of the imagination because they lack the specific element that you usually find in a genre. You don't see things like setting, theme, mood. Some people might want to call it a genre, but I will argue against that. Even though you can categorize it using a non-genre based form of categorization, which we discussed in the final lesson. We spoke about something called children's films, which is a category, adult films, but they are not genre based. Okay, in this lesson, there's a portfolio activity. This portfolio activity, remember, is not a reshoot activity, it's portfolio, it's different. You're going to write a one-page essay answering the following question. And the question is this: if you were making a movie and you were going to explore one of the three things that I am mentioning here, that I'm stating here, what genre would it be? Let's say that you're making a movie that is going to explore your deepest fears, the things that really scare you. And, you know, maybe something scares you that doesn't necessarily scare other people. Don't tell me you're afraid of Godzilla or Frankenstein because those are not real fears. I'm talking real fears. What could be considered real fears? Failing in a test, failing a grade, losing your job, getting cancer, getting coronavirus, um, being rejected by someone that you love. All those things are real fears. So I don't know what is a real fear for you, but you have to know yourself. And the question I'm asking you here is, if you were making a film based on your deepest fears, what would it be? You don't necessarily have to think it's horror, but it might be. I don't know. Could you explore that fear with a drama? Would you be better? Would a thriller be better suited to explore that fear that you have? That's what I want you to answer. To tell me what the genre would be and why. In addition to that, you're going to answer the question: if you're making a movie about your biggest hope, you know, we all have hopes and aspirations about things that we expect to achieve in life or hope to see in our lives. What genre would you use to explore your biggest hopes? I don't know what your biggest hopes are, again, only you know that. Maybe your biggest hope is to one day go to space because you want to be an astronaut. Or maybe your biggest hope is to become a doctor because you want to help people. Or maybe your biggest hope is to see mom and dad get back together again because they separated. I don't know what your biggest hope is, but what genre could you use to explore that hope? Again, would it be drama? Would it be romance? Would it be science fiction? Would it be action adventure? I don't know. Only you can say. And finally, if you were making a movie based on things that baffle you, when I mean baffle, I mean confound, things that you look at them and you scratch your head and you go, I don't understand this. What would that, what genre would you use to explore that? And when I mean things that baffle and confound people is, for example, at my age, I'm still baffled when I see that bad people get away with things and good people suffer. I'm saying, like, how come this guy, he has it so good, and look at this good person and look at how they're suffering? It's baffling. But what genre would I use to explore that? Well, I'm not saying, but I don't know what baffles you. I don't know what confounds you. Only, again, you know. So, what will you use? What genre will you use to explore that? So, you have to answer three things. Basically, three questions in one. You're going to write one essay answering what genre you would use to explore for a movie that explores your deepest fear. Another one, what genre will you use for a movie that explores your biggest hope? And what genre will you use to explore a film that about things that baffle you, that confound you? You're going to do that essay, and you're going to send it to my email because remember, this is not uh, a reshoot. You don't upload this. The portfolios are always sent to my email, and the reshoots, you know that they're always uploaded to their proper lesson. So, guys, I'm going to stop here. This is all I have for you today. I hope that this was informative. I hope that this has been helpful, and I'll be seeing you in our next lesson. You all take care. God bless you all. Have a great weekend.